7 Tonight show guests who came on high as a kite. The iconic blue curtain recesses. Johnny Carson walks out to his spot, begins his monologue, and settles into his chair. But beneath this smooth operation, there existed a maelstrom of chaos, which rarely made it on screen. That would be a nightmare tape. Carson had what everyone who worked with him realized almost telepathically. It took him maybe a nanosecond to size people up as they walked out. Whether they were drunk, stoned, coked up, or something more serious. He could detect it immediately, said a Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson throughout the 1970s. Proclaimed it before he even said anything. Carson's eyes would cloud with amusement and a hint of horror. Oh my God, here we go. It looked as if he were truly curious about these strangers. While Carson exuded classic cool on stage, things backstage were more like a house of horror, and production assistants were on watch. The 1970s were crazy times, began the former producer. They would have legitimate stars and legends and Oscar winners, and even literary giants who were so drunk they couldn't even remember their own names. But Carson could make it all look so normal as he babysat someone who was having a completely different reality. The Green Room Bar became notorious, remembered a production employee who worked on the show in the 1970s and 1980s. Carson himself would review and okay the liquor brands, demanding only the best. But it had become an unspoken understanding that a celebrity might have just one drink, and that two might be pushing it, but nobody could outright enforce it on big stars. And aside from drinking, a more permissive attitude toward recreational drug use meant that many stars came with a drink or two in them from indulging in their drug of choice for recreation. Weakened by pot and possibly cocaine and sedation from prescriptions or a combination of several substances, it usually became very visible once they were on air. It was the age of Studio 54, with rock stars living like Roman emperors and even Wall Street executives with access to a mountain of cocaine. The Tonight Show itself was not an insulated phenomenon, but reflected its own culture and times, including recreational drug use. Carson himself enjoyed a drink, but controlled it perfectly on air, thus presenting an almost comical respite juxtaposed with people he interviewed who clearly were not as controlled. According to Carson's own producer, Carson could control every aspect of what he wanted based on who he interviewed and their level of intoxication. If they were just a mite loose from drink, he recalled, he'd bring them on gentle. But if they were really wasted, he'd dumb down his questions, let them ramble. And sometimes he'd just end an interview early, without anyone noticing. That would be a lesson he would have no shortage of opportunities to learn throughout his career at The Tonight Show. Number 1. George Carlin. George Carlin, the working stoner. Carlin's evolution, from clean-cut comedian to counterculture icon in the early 1970s, marked not only a change in his look, but also his comedy and life. This metamorphosis manifested itself on his appearances on The Tonight Show. A camera operator who worked on several of Carlin's shows remembered, he would riff like a mad genius and smile like a stoner. It was never a question. George wasn't camouflaging anything. That hint of stoner lethargy in his eyes had become an integral part of his act. According to Carlin, he made more than 130 appearances on The Tonight Show, making him Carson's favorite nattering nuisance. But Carson never invited Carlin back as guest host, as he would as a favor to several other comedians. Carson reportedly admired Carlin's intelligence, but had reservations about inviting him as a guest host. A former writer once explained, Johnny liked George's intelligence and creativity, but had reservations about George's dependability. He understood George's life and didn't know if he could pull off hosting 30 minutes, let alone an hour and a half. But what made Carlin special about the rest of the chemically altered guests he had on the show was that he still functioned. While they were muddled and unpredictable, Carlin remained articulately witty and professional, but with a distinctly relaxed air about him. As a staffer remembered, he was a functioning herbalist. The herbal doesn't affect him. It's fuel for his imagination. As George Carlin, he's still there, but with that mellow and more philosophical twist. Carson interacted with him as if he were aware of Carlin's altered state, but let it impact him as he adapted his own manner to highlight Carlin. Number 2. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was comedy's exposed raw nerve. George Carlin might have been about functional pot use, but Richard Pryor was about something much more explosive. He was a genius with problems with substances that could make a Tonight Show spot veer from brilliant to ominous at an instant. Remembered one stage manager who worked on several of Pryor's Tonight Show appearances. Richard might begin a bit as the brightest and funniest person in the room, but then he would look off into space and explode someplace in his mind. The Tonight Show band leaders had to work like traffic cops on several instances, gently nudging Richard back on message without making a scene. Richard Pryor's struggles with substances were no secret, and particularly cocaine use throughout the 1970s that would eventually lead to that notorious freebasing accident in 1980. Several appearances on The Tonight Show caught Richard Pryor at different but very volatile phases on this path. But then there was also a very telling bit in 1978, which began normally with Pryor talking about his recent work. But then, midway, he began with a joke about childhood and then slowly trailed off into a random assemblage of unrelated statements, as if he were losing focus. The audience was caught either in laughter, as they were not sure if he was doing an act or something serious. You could sense Carson move into protect mode for Pryor, as the stage manager replied. Carson's response to Pryor reflected perfectly well on a sense of balancing on admiring his talent, but worried about his well-being. Carson would not have acted like some hosts might do, who would capitalize on an impaired performer. Number 3. Truman Capote. Truman Capote, literary brain and television tragedy. Not all of the Tonight Show antics were caused by stand-up comedians. It was sometimes the people who would have been least likely who were involved in some of the most disturbing occurrences. Truman Capote, the lionized literary icon, would engage in a Tonight Show performance remembered for all the wrong reasons. The nation's darling literary man, stone cold drunk, encapsulated an evening as recalled by a production assistant. Truman Capote had made numerous Tonight Show appearances, delighting audiences with his clever repartee and urbane sense of humor. But on that evening, things would be very different. He was slurring so badly you could hardly make out what he was saying, remembered a sound technician. He would be leaning forward with his head down, and then he would jerk it back as if he had remembered he was on TV. The control room panicked and cut frequently to Carson's reaction shots, because at least he was making sense. Unlike with Carlin and Pryor, who had required Carson's patient and flexible adaptation skills, Carson's reaction with Capote was tense. Carson's smile began to freeze, and his questions grew simpler as he struggled to recover an unworkable segment. Johnny was furious, remembered an old producer. Not on camera, mind you, but as soon as they were on tape, he stormed backstage and yelled at the talent coordinator. Never again. He's done. Number 4. Cheech and Chong. Cheech and Chong were exactly as they appeared. While some Tonight Show visitors attempted to hide their use of chemicals, comedy duo Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong were as upfront with it as Sean Lennon was with his song about John Lennon. Their act began and ended with pot culture, and Cheech and Chong brought that authenticity with them to The Tonight Show. It took a league of its own commitment to be as stoner-centric as they were, and it put Cheech and Chong firmly at the end of an extremely large stick. It's what made Cheech and Chong so unusual among the show's cast of high society regulars. Carson's willingness to adapt to them instead of ignoring them. Johnny would project an extreme square image with them, remembered a Tonight Show writer. He would feign ignorance about their drug talk, offering leading questions that were perfectly ripe for the punchlines. It was clear what was taking place, and it added more laughs. Once, when he appeared on an unforgettable Tonight Show visit promoting Up in Smoke, Chong began an unlinear storytelling about making a film. Carson could have pointed him back on track, but he let it ride, glancing at the audience with a stone-faced expression that brought an even greater audience laugh. Number 5. Peter Fonda. Peter Fonda, the easy rider but hard to deal with house guest, was the embodiment of the conflict between the era of counterculture and the strict rules of network TV. To this day, Fonda's iconic 1970 Tonight Show appearance remains among the oddest moments in the show's history. He mused about time travel. It was all over after no more than 5 minutes, as one director who worked on that evening remembers it. Fonda, who had already become an iconic figure from 60s rebellious youth and a vocal supporter for psychedelic use, strode out on stage like he was high on something, and everyone on staff at Tonight realized he probably was, likely LSD. From the very start, it was amply clear he would not make it through an average interview. His eyes were dilated. He gazed at the stage lights, then at his own hands, and then arbitrarily tried answering a question Carson had posed fully half a minute before. It was like watching someone bob in and out of our plane. Carson launched into damage control, simplifying the questions and maintaining an easygoing tone as he looked for an exit strategy. The critical moment came with a standard question about forthcoming projects. Fonda began answering as if nothing were amiss, but then launched into an observation about how time itself isn't linear, but more like a blanket encasing consciousness. At which Carson remarkably signaled the crew with a tap on his note cards, meaning an immediate transition to commercials. The planned 12-minute interview lasted but 5. Carson launched into his next guest without so much as an introduction. Fonda had vanished. Number 6. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed, the British Bulldog Unleashed, made one of the most unhinged and disturbing Tonight Show interviews in 1975. His episode proved the swiftness with which intoxication could progress from fun and entertaining to serious concern. Oliver Reed made headlines and blew no sense at all, as remembered a former NBC page. Oliver Reed came drunk and perhaps drunk on something more. At first, he slurred badly enough to be more or less contained, but he increasingly yelled and began acting erratically. Carson's reaction shifted with an instant understanding that Oliver Reed meant no laughing matter. As remembered a stage manager, Carson had an almost magical talent for knowing people, and he knew at once that Oliver Reed had no intention of presenting no laughing matter. Events took a tense turn as Reed began cutting Carson off with random calls and irrational statements. Suddenly, he popped up from his chair and began illustrating a fighting position. Carson and everyone on set were caught off guard, the presence of security personnel drawn closer. Number 7. Sammy Davis Jr. provided with some fuel by everyone's favorite entertainer. Sammy Davis Jr. made a Tonight Show performance that would be remembered as among the most memorable of the 1970s, not because he seemed intoxicated, but because of all the hubbub surrounding it. Davis's 1974 Tonight Show interview left everyone with something to talk about as it tried to determine what made this hyperactive entertainer tick. Cool on stage, it was chaos backstage, remembered a production assistant. Davis had already made himself a Carson favorite as someone who could seamlessly transition from telling jokes to singing and imparting career advice. But on this evening, he seemed to be taking it up a notch. Carson maintained perfectly well under Davis's rapid-fire pulse. He let Davis have all the solo time he wanted, interceding only if he wanted to prevent the interview itself from wandering wildly out of control. Carson never chose to acknowledge anything Davis said, but he made no bones about telling his staff he was tired just watching Sammy Davis. Davis never let things get out of his control. A difference here. Some drunk guests have completely broken down. Davis just functioned at an accelerated rate. To be sure, he gave the audience exactly what they wanted. It was just a kickstart. However, Carson's hospitality had boundaries. When a guest had turned aggressive and threatening or totally unable and unprepared to participate, Carson's indulgence ended. His 3 rules were easy and very specific. Do not threaten anyone, do not be insulting toward an audience, and do not fill airtime with pointless verbal babble. Carson would then discreetly uninvite anyone who violated these rules. Carson would be thanked for that instinct much later. Pryor once confessed that Carson had led him through media interviews he couldn't have handled because he would have been too stoned. Carson could have humiliated Pryor, but instead protected him. That served a very useful function. It helped sustain an ambience of warmth and decorum on Tonight, even when things were going haywire.